Well, hello and welcome to this session on system flexibility. My name is Rob Nickerson and I am the Electricity Market Modelling Manager working on the future energy scenarios. Now in this session, I'll start by a quick overview of what we mean by electricity system flexibility, before having a look at the key insights, an overview of the scenarios. We'll then take a closer look at a few specific flexibility types before concluding with a chart showing the amount of total flexibility available. I'll then hand over to the question and answer session. So this presentation covers electricity system flexibility only, and flexibility is required to match demand and supply on a second-by-second basis. Current electricity flexibility is predominantly all on the supply side. This is shown in yellow on the chart. The chart shows sources of flexibility. Specifically, this current flexibility comes mainly from the ability of thermal electricity generation and interconnectors to flex in response to changing demand, either by putting more power onto the system or scaling it back. In the net zero scenarios in 2050, large-scale electricity storage, which includes batteries, pump storage, compressed or liquid air storage, will become more important, along with hydrogen generation, which could play a role very similar to gas today. As dispatchable generation capacities decrease, particularly thermal generation, new demand-side flexibility will also become much more important. This is shown in blue. In a few years, generation will be dominated by variable renewables. And to maximise the use of this generation and avoid having to curtail it, it will become more important to adjust demand to match the variable supply. Now, demand-side response is made up of actions such as smart charging and vehicle-to-grid from electric vehicles, but it also includes residential, industrial, and commercial actions in response to market signals to move their demand. So now that I've set out broadly what this session is about, I'm going to start with the key overall messages from the flexibility section of the main report. We'll then move on to looking at some scenario specifics. The key messages are that high electrification and renewables requires a significant increase in flexibility, that consumer engagement in flexibility is highest in our high societal change scenarios, and that growth in flexible demand is required to absorb oversupply of electricity. Let's now have a look at some of the scenario specifics. So hopefully at this stage, most of you will have seen the FES 2020 scenario framework. Very quickly for those who haven't, this year we have 4 scenarios arranged on a 2x2 matrix. Speed of decarbonisation is on the x-axis, whilst level of societal change is on the y-axis. 3 of the 4 scenarios reach net zero by 2050. Now, if we start with steady progression, as this is the one scenario that doesn't achieve net zero, this has the lowest level of intermittent generation and the lowest requirement for flexibility. The requirement is met predominantly from dispatchable thermal generation, electricity storage, and increased interconnection. System transformation has high levels of intermittent generation with a medium requirement for flexibility. The requirement is met by a mix of technologies, including hydrogen plant. A medium level of electrolysis helps to absorb excess generation to prevent curtailment. Consumer transformation has very high levels of intermittent generation and electrification of demand. This results in a need for high levels of flexibility. This includes high levels of electricity storage, demand-side response, and electrolysis. Now, leading the way is very similar to consumer transformation by 2050. However, growth in flexibility occurs sooner to reflect the quicker path that leading the way takes to net zero. Now, to demonstrate the importance of flexibility, we're looking here at an example day in January 2025. This shows a day where renewable output exceeds demand. We see the demand across the day, shown as the black line, whilst the colours then show the generation used to meet this demand. There is some excess renewables, and that's shown in light green. And rather than curtail all of this, various forms of flexibility makes use of this energy. Now, in this example, storage and interconnectors are used to move around the energy, leaving only a small amount to be curtailed. That's the small sliver shown in red. Storage firstly imports or fills up before exporting or discharging back to grid later in the day around time of peak. We see that interconnectors are exporting across the whole day and that the amount of available generation increases over peak as more thermal generation is brought online and storage is utilised. Now, this is due to more interconnector exports as prices in Great Britain are favourable against those of the continent. So in effect, the thermal generation in Great Britain and the batteries discharging helps to support the exports across the interconnectors to provide electricity to our interconnected markets. Now, this is 2025, so the excess is predominantly exported. However, later we have electrolysis. And coming up at 2 p.m. today, there is a session specifically on the role of hydrogen and the ways in which it's produced. So it's not only produced from electrolysis. That presentation is led by Rob Gibson, and I encourage you to sign up if you haven't already done so. Now, for the more detailed look at flexibility technologies, let's start with interconnectors. Here we show the installed capacity increase in each scenario. Interconnection levels will be highest when there is demand for flexibility and there is a price differential across the markets. As noted, flexibility will be driven in part by higher levels of renewable generation, whilst the price differentials are driven by differences in carbon price, generation mix, and demand patterns in each interconnected market. Levels of interconnection increases in line with the level of societal change, and that's along the y-axis on the scenario framework I showed earlier. This corresponds to the requirement for more flexibility in leading the way and consumer transformation. The inclusion of a hydrogen network and lower electricity demands in system transformation reduces the requirement for electricity interconnection. Steady progression has the lowest level of interconnection as it retains high levels of dispatchable thermal generation. Now, the numbers here are driven by our site-by-site analysis, but also reflect the thinking from the recent network options assessment document published by some of our colleagues. This identified that higher levels of interconnection could be facilitated compared to our FES 2019 results from last year. Now, on this slide, we see the changing behaviour of the interconnectors, and we're looking specifically at leading the way. The chart on the left shows the interconnector flows by year. So because we're looking at annual flows, the y-axis is measured in terawatt hours. I've also split out the exports from the imports, so shown by the bars on the chart. The net position is shown as the net flows line in purple. We see that strong renewable growth in Great Britain leads to more exports than imports through the late 2020s and early 2030s. Electrolysis demand in Great Britain then increases at a significant rate from 2030. And as such, we see the net flow position briefly return to one of GB imports. During this period, the EU renewables also grow, which also impacts the net flows position. Now, one thing to note is that as the net flows return to zero in 2038, the use of the interconnectors is very different from when net flows were close to zero in 2025. As the bars show, the volumes of energy traded throughout the year has approximately doubled. In effect, the interconnectors are being used to balance large volumes of renewable generation across each of the markets. In the last few years, EU renewable growth levels off from 2040, whilst GB renewable growth continues to increase. And consequently, the net flows return to being one of an export. We can also look briefly at a little bit more detail. On the second chart, we see the hourly net flow throughout July, aggregating all of the individual interconnectors. The orange line shows the flows in 2020, whilst the purple line shows the flows in 2050. The first observation is that the size of the flows, or the amplitude of the lines, increases significantly. This reflects the increased capacity. The second thing to note is that the volatility also increases dramatically. Indeed, in 2020, the interconnectors changed direction from import to export, or vice versa, 24 times during that month of July. By 2050, that has increased threefold to 74 times. It's also more balanced between import and export. In 2020, Great Britain exports for just 2% of the month, whilst in 2050, it is 58%. This reflects the changing use of the interconnectors to balance renewable output across each market. So next we're going to look at electricity storage, and I'm going to use the analogy of a straw and a cup to help explain storage. The size of the straw represents the connection capacity. Now that is the rate at which power can be supplied back to the grid, whereas the size of the cup represents the amount of energy that can be stored. Here on this chart we are looking at capacity. The dotted lines show the amount of capacity we have from pumped hydro, compressed air, liquid air, and battery storage. Values increase to the solid line when we include vehicle to grid. Now for vehicle to grid, we assume that not all vehicles will be available to provide power back to the grid at all times. Here we're showing the diversified available vehicle to grid capacity, and we're looking at the availability at 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Now, in regards to the total market participation, for every vehicle that is available to supply power back to the grid, there is another vehicle to grid capable vehicle that is not available. Across the scenarios, vehicle to grid is largest in leading the way at 19 gigawatts in 2050. Now I want to also highlight a bit more on storage characteristics. Returning to the straw and cup analogy, remember that the connection capacity, or the rate of power back to the grid, is analogous to the size of the straw. I have this on the y-axis. The amount of energy stored is represented by the size of the cup. I have that on the x-axis. Now let's look at the consumer transformation data. So if we start with 2030 data, we see that pumped hydro continues to represent the largest amount of energy stored. Remember, that's the cup. Whilst battery storage combined now represents the largest capacity back to the grid. Remember, that's the straw. By 2050, we see significant increases in all storage technologies. Battery and vehicle-to-grid dominate by the numbers, but we also see growth in compressed air, liquid air, and pumped storage. These have a high ratio between the amount of energy stored and the connection capacity. They can help balance the system over longer durations. Vehicle-to-grid has the largest combined amount of energy stored. However, just with the vehicle-to-grid capacity, not all of this storage may be available at any one time. Now I want to end our closer look at flexibility types with demand flexibility. This changes during the year, so we are looking specifically at the amount of downward demand flex available at time of system peak. Because it is system peak, I've not included electrolysis demand here, as we assume it won't be running. Whilst this covers downward flex to reduce peak, it is important to note that demand side response can also go the other way to increase demand to meet available generation. The example here is leading the way, and we're looking at 2050. On the left-hand side, we see a peak of 107 gigawatts prior to any flex. Moving left to right down the waterfall, you see that our average cold spell peak assumption includes 4 components of demand flexing in order to reduce the peak to 76.2 gigawatts. The largest of these flexes is hybrid heat pumps switching over to hydrogen. Now the ACS, or average cold spell peak, is the peak value we use in FES. However, it can be further reduced via a couple of additional types of demand side flex within the industrial and commercial sectors. I've also shown the impact of vehicle-to-grid here. Although vehicle-to-grid is a generation, it impacts the amount of demand seen on the electricity networks. Finally, I leave you with this chart. Now, whilst comparing types of flexibility is a bit like comparing apples and pears, the chart does at least give an overview of the relative size of each type of flexibility available. Demand-side response, particularly from electrolysis, becomes much more important in the net zero scenarios in 2050. The chart also nicely demonstrates that flexibility requirements per scenario correlate to the level of installed wind and solar capacity. Now that's shown as the overlaid diamond. So in summary, we see a significant increase in flexibility. Consumer engagement in flexibility is linked to our societal change axis. And this level of flexibility helps minimize curtailment of renewable generation to help match demand to variable supply. I will now hand over to Laura Moody to start the question and answer session. Thank you.